Much like the £10 note, which, as we've just heard, operated as the initial locus for our object-centred study, the photograph is often simultaneously ubiquitous and invisible. Whereas the regularity of the £10 notes flow through our hands ensures that we often see it as imagined unit rather than material object, the photograph poses different difficulties. The individual photograph inhabits a strange role as both presentational and material, and I think it's often difficult to extradite ourselves from what a photograph shows and recenter our focus onto what it is. In the present moment, where many of our experiences of the photographic image reach us through a computer screen or a mobile phone, and are thus inseparable in some ways from other media forms, photographs seem to have become immaterial and dislocated from their original physical form. Within my own study, even beginning to think about the photo as an object in its own right proffered up myriad conceptual challenges. My object of individual study is a photographic album compiled at some point in the closing years of the 19th century and measuring 51 by 35 centimetres, and the album is pictured here as I saw it in the UCL Art Museum, and it's also positioned over there. It comprises over 250 photographs of the United States during this period, and it seems to give a sense of movement between these spaces as it's divided into region and takes into account the landscape, peoples and infrastructure of each. When coming into contact with the object, I was not allowed to touch it, so it was leafed through by a supervisor, and I was supervised during each of my visits, meaning that my connection with the materiality of the individual photograph and the album itself was even further disrupted. Indeed, I spent a large part of the initial phase of the project asking what my object could tell me through poring over the individual photographs and attempting to stick to my training as a cultural historian in asking how the way they were shaped could enliven our understanding of the people who made them. When we come into contact with photographs in our work, I think that the immediate response is not only to look through the photo, denying its materiality and seeing it as a window, but also to want to look behind it. I looked initially for the rationale behind these photographs and for what reason they were being taken. Why this place? Why that woman? Who was standing behind the lens? And how did their choices reflect their experience of the world more broadly? I think this is a difficulty when embarking on an object-centred study for historians. I realised in the course of looking at the photographic album how easy it is to see the cultural, social and economic tendrils trailing behind the object, and for the object itself to become transparent. We should never rely wholly on physicality, I think, in historical research, but the early weeks of my study made me grasp quite how quickly my brain jumped from object to cultural narrative. And I also think it speaks to issues of what we expect an object to tell us in the context of our research. I decided eventually to try and help myself past this by viewing the album as a singular object rather than a series of individual images. The staff at UCL Art Museum, where the object is stored, mentioned on my initial visit that this album had never been displayed. It was altogether an anomalous object. It clearly didn't fit well into any particular collection and was devoid of provenance. No one knew how it entered the museum. The images seem to move fluidly between our now well-defined ologies, leaping from Aztec skull to a block of Chinese tenement flats in San Francisco to a figure standing outside the oldest house in the United States, in New Mexico, with its tenant standing in front. This, I imagine, makes it difficult to display, as the album refuses to fit with any clear process through which knowledge is being ordered, and cannot be used as an example of any particular type of progressive narrative other than the journey itself. Although the album fits into the broad category of late 19th century travel album, in which photographs were brought along the trip and then later arranged into a reimagined narrative of the journey, in the art museum it seems to be an oddity in its placement. On my first visit, it was pointed out to me as an object which had caused great fascination. Indeed, a guest blog written about the object in 2012 refers to it as the mysterious travel album, and wrote about it as being a split between the ethnographic and geographic. The space in which the object exists has forced it to sit uneasily, I think. Although it's remarked upon as an amazing object and a strange object, its past and potential uses seem to be clouded, and it is not seen as representing a part of any collection. It's a curiosity within the UCL Art Museum collection, and I think its refusal to display a finished, comprehensible form of collected knowledge is partly behind this. Exhibitions and displays often need to form an assemblage of objects which are required to speak with each other, and this particular object seems to have remained silent, despite the existence of other similar albums in other collections. The complexity of the object may well be to do with its placement in the UCL Art Museum as an institutional space. It could easily, I think, have been classified as something suitable for an archive, a library, or perhaps even the ethnographic collections held at UCL. Its format is book-like, and it contains many notes as well as photographic images. However, clearly a decision was made at some point that the album was best expressed as a piece of art. This space and the object's necessary interaction with those around it has very specific repercussions. Through being placed next to our objects, and when I went to look at the object, it was surrounded by paintings, sculptures, I would argue that the expectation of the object to represent a fully formed type of understanding is compounded. Alongside paintings, drawings and sculptures, the space requires the album to become for the discerning eye, to become a final product of a process whose aim is usually, although of course not always, to transmit a coherent set of ideals and performed understandings. This really flagged up to me the importance of seeing the space in which we come into contact with an object. I recently went to look at swords in the National Maritime Museum stores, and naturally they were organised next to other weapons of their type. However, if they'd been set next to the other possessions owned by an individual, or next to a collection of cutlery, or another object, I may well have understood them in a very different framework. Objects never exist on their own, not only when we are looking into the past to understand the material worlds of men and women, but also when we ourselves are coming into contact with them. And I think this moment was really stressed by my repeated return to the object. Although I mentioned earlier my imagined narrativization of the object as a cultural object, there is also a material narrativization which takes place when we come into contact with an object. And this consists of a conversation between space, the object in question, the objects in situ, and the observer. We should not then intend to see the spaces in which we observe objects academically as cultural vacuums, as easy as it is to feel like some museum storerooms exist outside of the real world. What this project has helped me to understand, through looking at the object in its materiality and closely, is that my understanding of this is contingent on not only the spaces of the past, but also those of the present. I'm not sure how we remedy the way in which museum storerooms, archives, or reading rooms impact on our relationship with an object, or indeed if we should try. However, I feel that considering these quiet conversations between the objects we're centring on, the bedfellows it shares with, and the spaces these exist within, allows us to better understand how our own relationships work with the material world, in historical research and in general. The album, I think, acts as a fairly disruptive object, one whose uneasiness in its material archive has forced me to consider the effect which the dialogue between object and space has. Its uneasiness has also allowed me to look at how objects which cannot tell part of a story which we recognise in the moment that we see them, or do not refer to a point in a narrative of our knowledge base, can be construed as ephemera or oddity in a museological context. Both the object itself and the space in which it exists are parts of archaeologies of understanding. The object itself has been removed from its type as a travel album in some ways, and has been re-articulated as a mysterious artefact, one whose role seems to be either a representation of modern disciplines in gestation, or of a collection of curiosities. However, the reason for its appearance to us in this way is the physical collection which it currently exists as a part of. Within the museum collection, the object becomes itself part of an archaeology of understanding, one made up of the way in which the objects and spaces it comes into contact with shape and are shaped by it. It is only by picking apart how we see objects as part of these collectives, the travel album as a type of object, and the art museum's collections as an assemblage, that I think that we can begin to question how we use the object as a singular artefact.